Do good work is not a label, but a way of living. It is the constant and diligent effort to achieve a new level of excellence in one's own life. It is the hidden inner beauty behind the struggle to achieve excellence. It's not perfect, but imperfect. It is the effort, discipline, and focus that often goes unnoticed. The goal of Do Good Work is to highlight that drive. The guests I have on this show emulate this drive in their own special way. You'll be able to apply new ideas into your own life by learning from them. We will also have one-on-one episodes with me where we'll dive into my own experience with entrepreneurship and leadership. Every episode is designed to provide you with ideas that you can apply and grow in excellence in all areas of your life, business, and career.
Today on the show, we have Ryan Frederick. Ryan is a founder and product person at heart. He's had the privilege of being part of starting and growing several software and service companies. He has helped companies grow from inception to vitality through to sustainability. During the evolution of these companies, Ryan has served on company boards and has been instrumental in capitalization activities. He has also helped companies to expand into international markets. And he combines a unique blend of business acumen and technical knowledge, having originally been a developer who migrated to the business side. He now helps companies build great software products and solve data challenges for competitive advantage as a principal at the product and data consulting firm AWH. Ryan is an active angel investor, mentor and advises entrepreneurs and startups, as well as corporate innovation leaders. He launched a nonprofit workforce development program to train underemployed adults on digital skills called i.c.stars. In addition to authoring his books, Ryan speaks frequently about the product, founder, and startup journeys, and he's on the mission to educate and inspire founders and company builders. Well, Ryan, thank you so much for being on, man.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
So Sell Naked. That's the title of your next book. And I do love the title, but having a pre-chat before the podcast going live right now, you distinguish the difference between running or owning and running a product-based company versus owning and running a professional services-based company. Can you dive us into the differences, also what inspired you to write the book and some of the insights?
Yeah, I think, there are some commonalities for sure. Things like culture and recruiting and, finance and, some of those things. But even when you start getting into finance and accounting, the existences are very different. Mm-hmm. So I had the opportunity to join AWH, the product firm that I'm now a partner in 9 years ago. And this has been my first opportunity to run a professional services firm, even though I've had lots of friends running them and I've certainly engaged and hired many over the years for product companies. But this was my first experience sort of hands-on having to figure out how are we going to grow? What are the levers to running a services firm that are different than the levers running a product firm? Mm-hmm. And some of them are obvious on the surface. Yeah. And then some of them are a little less obvious and maybe even a little bit counterintuitive. And one of the things that I think gets really lost in the shuffle is services firms operate in most instances now because retainers have gone by the wayside, and retainers are so 1980s now. Mm-hmm. That every services firm operates as a bank, right? Huh. You pay your team to ply the work, right, and to apply their craft, and then you invoice the client for what you've done, and then the client takes some period of time to pay you, maybe on receipt, maybe net 10 days, maybe 30, maybe longer if it's a big corporation. Mm-hmm. So you're floating all of that money, right, and all of that cash, and then figuring out, well, how do you manage your profitability, but then how do you also manage your cash flow, right? Is a very different existence than a product where when someone subscribes, they're typically paying you as soon as they become a subscriber or after some free trial period. Mm-hmm. So the cash flow, financial accounting aspects of services firms are immensely different than product companies. That's just one example of how things are different.
And I want to dive into that actually, because I've come across a lot of service-based entrepreneurs who run companies, and they do a lot of like the retainer model, where retainers, besides like a one-time payment for a short-term project, like maybe 8 to 12 weeks, there's nothing outside of that from looking at quarterly projects and how the perfect analogy, floating them like a bank, getting the work done, obviously getting a return on that work, but also waiting for, I don't know, X amount of time, 60 days, not 30, whatever it is, to get the cash flow coming in. Why do you distinguish that retainer models are so 1980s? That's really interesting to me.
Yeah, because very few clients now will sign up for a retainer. Because retainers were the agency services firm model of having predictability to their business,
yep,
but also having high margins.
Yep.
And so clients, when they realized that retainers actually served the agencies better than themselves, clients then pushed back on them and said, we're not going to do a retainer. We'll keep engaging you and we'll keep working with you as long as we keep getting value out of it. And we're just going to sort of do it on a continuous, yes, we wake up every day saying we want to keep working with you basis. And that increased the value to clients exponentially, because they were no longer writing a check in hopes of, oh, I hope we get value against this month. Now it's they get the value before they write the check. So the equation completely flipped in favor of clients, away from agencies and away from retainers, which in the end I think is good, because I think the retainer model was too lopsided toward agencies and did not offer enough value to clients. But now, since it's flipped entirely the other way, agencies and services firms now serve as banks because they're funding that work before they ever get paid from clients.
It's pretty interesting, and obviously having opportunities or leverage to be able to float that time frame. But for companies who are going through this, and it hits us like a chord for a lot of service-based entrepreneurs that I work with. For companies that are going through this, what would be some of the tactical strategies or maybe mindset shifts in order to look at, if I'm moving away from a retainer-based client, serving my clients at a higher level, but also maintaining the relationship over a long period of time, not just like a couple months, like a couple of years? What would be some of the methodology that you take people through to go through that?
Yeah, well, you said the key word, and it's relationship, because we're in the retainer world, all of the relationship work was at the beginning, and agencies would wine and dine, prospective clients to win their business. And then they sort of, once they had them on like a year retainer or a 2-year retainer, they sort of didn't care anymore, because they knew they had the business and they had that client, locked in for 2 years. Now, and with the flipping to almost no retainers, now it's all about relationship. And now it's all about relationship day in, day out. And it's not just building a relationship enough for a client to hire you, but it's about how do you solidify and how do you cultivate that relationship over time while you're doing the work, when it's the hardest time to cultivate the relationship. Because at the beginning, when you're just theoretically talking about engaging together, and it's sort of like dating, right? When you're theoretically talking about being in a relationship and you're just getting to know each other and you're flirting and all of that sort of stuff, it's easy, right? The hard work comes when you get into it, and now you're in the relationship, and now you find out what you don't like about the other person. And they find out what they don't like about you. And the same thing happens with service firms and clients, right? Once you start working together and it gets hard, that's when the relationship really has to surface. And that's when the relationship really matters and pays off. Because a client, for most services firms, and I'm sure this is the case for most services firms out there, it's true for us at AWH, that none of our clients are locked into us more than 30 days, right? And so beyond that, and in fact, they could tell us to stop working on their behalf, on their product tomorrow. And even though we might be contractually still tied together for 30 days, they could tell us to stop working tomorrow, and we wouldn't work for the next 29 days on their stuff. And so every services firm client relationship is now so fragile that if a client isn't receiving continuous value and you're not continually delivering that, and if you're not continually evolving the relationship, clients can go seek another service firm to work with really at a moment's notice. And they do if that relationship and that value equation breaks down too much.
And that makes a lot of sense because it raises the bar not only for your team to deliver quality work every single time, but it also raises the bar for having someone on your team designated to focusing on relationship. At least that's the way that I look at it when I work with clients, is having someone to really focus in on the strategic level, on the client relationship level, and making sure that we're doing not just what's beneficial for the current project or the current time frame with that client, but what they're going to need after that's done, the next maybe 2 or 3 key decisions or moves. I like that, that shift in mindset and having the relationship. Besides, so that's a key focus, the cash flow, the financial. What are some of the other things that you dive into in your book, Sell Naked, and that distinguish the differences between product and service-based businesses?
Yeah, a product firm is often a sort of upfront investment, and then you collect against that investment over time. Mm-hmm. And your overhead is often then stays pretty static throughout, the growth of a product firm. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are product firms out there that have, $100 million valuations, and they have 30 team members, mm-hmm. right? The service firm spectrum is completely different than that. The only way you grow a services firm really is you hire another person to ply their craft on client behalfs. Mm-hmm. So the ability to scale a product company versus a services firm are night and day.
Yeah.
There is no scalability to a services firm, right? It is, you just add one more team member, and then you get a little bit of incremental revenue and a little bit of incremental margin from that new team member. And then the only way to grow again is you hire another team member and then another team member.
Yeah.
But that is methodical growth, right? That is, that's not scalable, right? Raise some venture capital and pour some rocket fuel on it, and then the whole thing's going to blow up, right? Yeah. And but in services firms can also grow too quickly, mm-hmm. right? Because if you, and I've seen a lot of services firms do this over the years, where they anticipate a large client engagement, or they anticipate, them having skill in an area now that they think is going to take off, and they hire team members in anticipation of mm-hmm. that business growth. And then it doesn't happen, or it doesn't happen to the level they thought it would, and now they're sideways, right? And so you're better off as a services firm, I think, growing slowly,
yes,
than growing quickly, because mm-hmm. growing quickly as a services firm is going to get your overhead and your numbers and your operation completely out of whack. Where if you grow slowly and you can manage that growth, then you have a chance to do it in a way that's sustainable and viable, and not just a short-term spike where we hired 20 people, but then 3 months later, 18 of them are gone, right? That doesn't really serve anybody's purpose, even though at that spike moment, it feels good because it feels like you're about to take off. But if that's not on solid footing, then it's probably not going to be very sustainable.
No, that makes a lot of sense, to be able to grow methodically. And right now we're going to be in audio only, but for our listeners, think about it like a staircase. So you grow, and then you grow one step at a time, as opposed to the J-shaped curve that we idolize from Silicon Valley. That is just like rocket fuel growth. Because when you grow methodically, like we just talked about, step by step, then you're going to make sure the cash flow is there. You're not going to burn employees. You're not going to overhire them, be in debt for whoever you hired, had to let them go if a client deal didn't go through. So I think there is opportunity to grow as a service-based company, but it's not going to be as quickly or as quote unquote easily as you see with a product or a SaaS-based company.
Yeah, absolutely. But I do think, but I don't want to send the message that services firms shouldn't grow and shouldn't have the intention of growing. They should, but you just have to do it methodically, because if mm-hmm. you're a services firm that is not growing, you're regressing and you just don't know it yet. Because if you're a services firm that isn't growing and you're in an industry that is experiencing growth, others are growing, you're just not growing. And you might not have visibility to the other firms growing, but if you're not growing, then you're really regressing. You just haven't experienced, right, the impact of that regression yet.
That's pretty interesting to look at that, because I know that there are like reports that you can look up, like IBIS reports, to see how quickly or how fast an industry is growing. When you're looking at that, is there a cadence that you should like, and do you suggest like a cadence or a certain growth factor year over year or maybe month over month to look at, we should be growing at this incremental percentage or being able to keep up with what the market's doing? Do you look at that in a competitive analysis?
Yeah, I do. And I don't pay a lot of attention to, do what could be perceived as direct competitors.
Yeah.
But I do pay attention to what's happening overall in our industry and in our space that we either should be participating in, or if it's negative, that we should be avoiding and staying away from. And I think that after doing this now for 9 years, my expectation is that we're going to grow about 20% a year.
Okay.
And you can slice that in many different ways, right? You could look at it as 20% top line revenue growth. You could look at it as 20% profitability growth. You could look at it as 20% team growth, because if you're a services firm, your revenue and profit are probably directly related to the size of your team.
Yeah.
But I think if firms has looked at it and said our expectation of our operation should be that we grow 20% a year, I think that's reasonable, because for some services firms, that's not going to be a lot of growth, right? That might be hiring 2 people.
Yeah.
Right. And for a larger firm, it might be more consequential, and that might mean hiring 20 people, but 20% for a services firm, depending on the scale of the services firm, seems also like appropriate intentional growth, because if you're small, it might be adding 1 person. If you're a little bit larger, it might be adding a dozen people. But I think that's been a good benchmark for us to sort of say, if we have at least 20% growth in a year, then we feel pretty happy about that and pretty satisfied. And if we don't, then we sort of look at it and say, well, why were we at 17% or 18% or something south of 20%?
And there's a certain level, obviously, to get to that point, because obviously for companies who are, let's say they're starting off, or they have small teams, maybe 5 to 7 people, 5 to 8 people, they could quote unquote easily double or triple their top line revenue by implementing a few simple tactics. But I know that will stalemate at some point, where the inflection point is that, like, the more that you add doesn't necessarily mean you're going to grow at that same rate.
Absolutely.
Is there a sweet spot that you see that?
Yeah, I think you've got to get to probably 25 to 30 people. And then you're at a level where growth isn't so consequential to one action, right?
Yeah.
Because if you're a 5-person firm and you add 1 team member, you might double the size of the firm, right? Because that team member might be able to take on, depending on what work you do, that team member might be able to take on 10 projects in a year, right? That then doubled the size of the firm, right? And so certainly where you are and where you're starting, matters greatly as part of all of this. But I think that firms also have to be careful, because I was having a conversation with a friend of mine several years ago, and he's been running a branding agency for 20 plus years, and he's never had more than 5 or 6 people on his team. And now he's kind of stuck, though, because he's got no exit plan, right?
Oh, wow.
So he either runs it until he just doesn't want to show up anymore, or he sells it to his small team and they move it forward, right? Because or he finds someone from the outside who's going to acquire his little 5 or 6 person firm, which is highly unlikely. I mean, it's really hard to sell services firms.
Yeah.
Or he has to merge with another services firm, and somehow he gets acquired, out of it. That almost never goes well and successfully either. So if you, and it's not to say that you shouldn't be content with running a small services firm. If that's what you want out of it, that's okay.
Yeah.
But if you eventually want to be able to say, I want to be able to monetize what I've built over 20 years with this firm, being a 5 or 6 person services firm is going to be a really tough exit, because it's going to be really hard to monetize a team of that size, or someone's going to want to acquire you and write you a check for, that level, for the value that you've put into the firm building it for 20 years.
Yeah. That's pretty interesting, because you're looking beyond just the contracts, your client base, but also the processes that you do, like the processes that are proprietary to your signature way of doing the work, your branding work if you're a branding agency, your lead generation work if you're a lead generation agency. Like having those elements or those assets, those are tangible, but like you mentioned, the value that you put in over those 20 years, what is the end outcome? Like, are you looking to like sunset, to hand it off to a new generation, to sell it, to exit, to merge, and being realistic with the fact that it's not as easy as like, hey, let's just go and sell this to an investor.
Right. And that's a big difference between services firms and product companies. It's easier, much easier to sell a product company, right? Because you can package the product up and you can say, okay, Mr. or Mrs. new owner, here you go, and you hand the keys over to them, and they now own it. A services firm is it not nearly that well packaged, and a services firm, especially if you're small, like the one we were talking about, that firm is so dependent upon that founder, that owner operator, that if that person is out of the equation, the firm's value goes almost to zero, right? And so that's the other thing that I think people who run and operate services firms really need to think about, that the value of a services firm is almost directly correlated to how much or little involvement the ownership of the firm has to have in the day-to-day operations of the firm. If
And
ownership,
I argue that the further away that the owner is and the work still gets done, the more valuable the company can be.
Exactly. Yep. Because now it's easier to package it up and make it more look more like a product company than if the owners, operators are knee deep in the weeds every day delivering to clients in a services firm.
Do you go through that, like how to make your services firm into a product company? Like obviously there's differences in finances and hiring and the way that you manage people, because it's all labor intensive. But do you go through that, how to productize your services company?
Yeah, I do. And one of the aspects of that is many services firms look at sort of marketing and they look at business development in a traditional sort of services firm sense, in that they depend upon a lot of referrals and a lot of word of mouth, which is, there's nothing wrong with those things. But if you don't, and that will only support growth to a certain level.
Yeah.
The other aspect of that is, if you don't develop a business development engine, and if you don't develop the mindset of having a marketing firm inside of your services firm, then if somebody were to try to come acquire you or to put a value on the business, if all of your new business comes from word of mouth and referral, and they can't replicate that, then somebody's not going to buy your firm, because there's no business development engine that they can just take over from you.
Exactly.
Right? And so the way a lot of services firms get business doesn't support an exit or a valuation at the level that they would like. It makes it really hard for them to exit. And the other aspect of that is, the more that you put a business development engine in for a professional services firm, the more that firm operates and looks like a product company, because now you're doing lead generation and client acquisition much more similar to a product firm than a traditional sort of services firm, referral, word of mouth, go, take somebody out to dinner to try to, persuade them to engage with you. So I write a lot about, and that's why the book is called Sell Naked, because there's a whole section in the book just about building a business development engine inside of a services firm that doesn't just depend upon referrals and word of mouth.
That is key. And I want to dive into the flip side of that. But for this specific scenarios, like if you're looking to exit your company, looking to have predictability, whoever is going to acquire you, even if it's a strategic merger, if it's an acquisition, or if you're handing it off to someone else, they want predictability because that brings about peace of mind, but also that's a forecast that they could see a return on their investment. Because typically when people buy a business, they're going to take a loan out. So they're going to either put some money down or get some investors, and everyone always wants to see a return, at least within the first 5 years of acquiring the company. And the number one thing that you can do besides delivering your services like a product, like making sure that it's always going to hit a minimum requirement, is making sure that you always have lead generation happening and have a predictable stream of leads, clients coming through, so that new business owners who take over the company aren't left in the dark. Going into the flip side, so we talked about, like, this is a realistic look at the services, and I really appreciate this perspective. Let's look at the good sides of it. Like if it's harder than a product-based company, if it's definitely a little bit more tricky when it comes to cash flow, even when you're exiting, let's talk about what are the great things about running a service-based company.
Yeah, because there are lots of really good aspects to it. One of the things that I now say is services firms are really easy to start and really hard to grow. Because anybody can put out a shingle and ply their craft, and now they're a services firm. Along with that, it can come, a lot of freedom and independence around the clients that you take on, the work that you do, how intense you are about the business, and how aggressively you want to grow it, et cetera. So there can be lots of freedom and independence, around how you structure a business and what it gives you as an owner that you want out of the business personally. It also, and for many people that start services firms, it's a mechanism for them to ply their craft in a way that they can do it to their own accord, right, and around their own intentions and around their own interests, which is good. I also think that services firms by nature, since it's a team of craftspeople providing some service to a client that a client can't otherwise do on their own, or doesn't have a better alternative to somehow solve. Yeah. And I think that services teams get really close. It's highly collaborative. The culture at most services firms is that of a sports team, right? Because everybody sort of has to show up every day and bring their best. And when they don't bring their best, someone else on the team sort of picks them up, right? And says, I got you, and, it's going to be okay. So services firms, even, as they get, approaching 100 people and more, still are very familial in nature and supportive, and it feels like everybody's in it, because everybody in a services firm knows that it's hard. That creating and serving clients, right, is hard. And so everybody knows that they have to show up every day, otherwise they're letting their teammates down. It's a little bit different in product companies, where once the product gets built, then is the product evolving, and are you trying to sell it to more people? Yes, but it's not the same. Product companies go through different phases and evolutions over the course of the existence of the company. Services firms go through much fewer evolutions, right? It's just the team gets bigger, but the culture sort of remains the same, and the dynamics stay the same, where product companies can go through many different evolutions, where the company, frankly, looks completely different and feels completely different than it did 2 evolutions ago.
That makes a lot of sense. And the cool part about running a service-based company is like the team culture that you build. That if that's your personality, that's the way that you want to, work for the next 10, 15, 20 years, is having that environment and fostering that talent, and even creating careers that way too. I think that's a really good benefit to it. And also, I think this always boils down to like the career path that you want to take with your company. Like, do you want to exit in the next 5 to 10 years, or do you want to work like your friend, work in the company for the next 20 years and be able to, work day in, day out and continue to address a serviceable need in the marketplace, but also adjust the company based on your preference. Because there's nothing wrong with running that company, having that be a cash flow machine for you to do other projects, maybe SaaS or other investments or real estate. So whatever it may be, looking at it as a holistic mix.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think people that own and run services firms and especially people that are starting new ones, they have to really make a conscious decision of, do they want to be a craftsperson in the company, or do they eventually want to become a business person that now leads other craftspeople?
I love that distinction. It's almost like the entrepreneur versus the freelancer.
Yeah, and it's kind of the evolution that many founders go through, to become CEOs, right? You go from being a founder and initiator to being an operator. I think the same thing is true with services firms. You start out being a craftsperson often that starts a services firm, but then if you want to stay a craftsperson, that's okay. But just know that's going to mean certain things for your firm, versus if you intentionally transition over to being a business person and the CEO of the firm, you're probably not going to do much of the crafts, the craftsmanship anymore. You're going to be much more focused on strategy and positioning and recruiting and culture, where if you really love the craft and you want to do the craft for the entirety of your career, even owning your own firm, just know that you're signing off on things, right, for the future that are going to be very different than if you sign up for being a business person and a CEO of the firm.
And I like that perspective too, because it's like, what is the purpose of the business? Does this business end when you stop working in it? And as well as looking at not only just a short-term plan, but also knowing that as a craftsperson, you could transition into the business person eventually. Like there's nothing stopping you from transitioning towards that, or if you're a business person, from you to starting a new craft. So there's always the flexibility. I don't think, unless I'm curious to know your thoughts on this, Ryan, like if it's once you set your ways towards that path, it's hard to adjust, but I think that there is flexibility down the line.
Yeah, there is. I do think it's challenging once you make the transition from being craftsperson to business person. I think it's then challenging to go back to being a craftsperson, because you're either doing it because now that you're either going into a new craft in a new area, or you're going back into a craftsperson into your own firm because it's almost like a second career where now someone else has stepped up to take over the leadership of the firm, and you can almost go back to where you started, right? Which is, I can go back and actually be a craftsperson inside of the firm I started, because I've got somebody else who's now taken the baton to be the CEO and to be the leader of the firm.
I love that. I love that. Well, Ryan, this was a very enlightening conversation. For our listeners out there, what's the best place for people to go to thank you for this interview, as well as to learn more about your new book coming out?
Yeah, thanks for that. And thanks for having me. awh.net is the product firm that I own. That the book Sell Naked is mostly based upon my experience owning and operating for the last 9 years. And my personal site is ryanfrederick.biz, and both the books are available through that site.
Wonderful. We'll put all those links in the show notes. Ryan, thank you again for being on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.